infrastructure, constantly improve our trade and industrial policies, and lower the cost of doing business. The sheer amount of work that needs to be done requires that we, as governments, schools of business, and other partners continue to work together to address the challenges that we just mentioned. Some of these challenges, as I said, include poverty, social inequalities, unemployment. Africa has already made strides in being a participant in the World Economic Order. A range of international indices observe that although there are challenges in the country, there are many positive developments, particularly in the area of entrepreneurship, and I believe a lot of investment and work have gone into this over the last few years. The just concluded 2014 World Economic Forum Global Competitive Index ranked Africa not as high as we want it to be, but probably higher than it's ever been before. Going forward then, I believe you as leaders of the business school, you'll need probably to drive some of these issues. Like, how do we make ourselves self-sufficient so that we consume our own rather than consume imports? Because we have the market. So what we need to do is to produce what we consume so that we export a lot less of what we have. Also, we need to boost exports and work on import replacements. We need more talent-driven innovations. We need to shorten the decision-making process within governments so that we are able to turn around some of the innovations that we come up with. We need to put pressure on state-owned enterprises to innovate. We need to look at our infrastructure so that Africans can trade by themselves. Actually, it's easier. Like the last meeting was in Morocco. But to go to Morocco, actually you have to go to Paris or Amsterdam. You get there faster than flying straight to Morocco. We need to integrate the rest of Africa to offer strong competition to China. I know it's a bit of a dream, but that's what we should aim for. And of course, India. To achieve some of this, the schools must work with governments and investors in developing our countries and strengthen our business environment, increase our access, not only to our own local markets, as I said before, but to the international markets. We will also need to work with developed countries to improve especially energy, because one of the things that has really hampered us, and more particularly in Kenya, is cost of energy. Our cost of energy is twice what it is in Cape Town in Kenya, and it is 3 times in Egypt, and that makes the cost of production to be very, very high. But above all, us as Africans, we don't believe in ourselves. I don't know for what reason, yet Africa has got some of the greatest minds. Africa has got some of the greatest people whose abilities and intellect is being used elsewhere. But on the other hand, us as government, we need to listen to enterprises. Us as government, we need to listen to educators like yourselves. And Professor Njenga did talk quite a bit on the importance or the strategic place where that Nairobi is in. We are the entry to a market of nearly 300 million people. So our position in gaining this or in accessing this market cannot be gainsaid. And we would like to play that role so that this particular potential or its place in access to this hinterland market is actually exploited. So we're looking forward to engaging yourselves during this meeting or after the meeting, Professor, and see what we can do together. I like what you said about integrity, because integrity is everything. And I always say there are two types of people in life. There are missionaries and mercenaries. And I don't know how missionaryship can be measured, especially in the development of your programs, in the people that you train. But if Africa is going to change, we need more missionaries than mercenaries. So ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I just want to wish you a fantastic, great conference, and we're looking forward to sharing some of the outputs that you will come up with. And Professor, I would like to just indicate to you that we've started some work. We're now doing the roads that comes to the business school. Thank you very much, and enjoy the conference.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Dr. Kidero. And we assure you, those of us here are ready to play the role of being missionaries in society, to spread good through our business schools, through our organizations, to transform Africa through leadership, to transform Africa through virtue. We appreciate the time that you have taken to be here. We know that you came straight from the airport from another engagement, and this is highly appreciated. Thank you for the sacrifice that you have made. Ladies and gentlemen, kindly give him another round of applause. We shall move forward to our next session, and this session is the role of institutions in Africa's economic story. The session shall be chaired by Dr. Robert Mudida, a senior lecturer in Strathmore Business School, who is also the academic director in our Master of Public Policy and Management program. Dr. Mudida, please welcome. Please give him a round of applause.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Most welcome to Strathmore Business School. And may my co-presenters please proceed and sit that side. Great privilege to have very distinguished presenters here. Professor Terry Ryan, who's currently the chairman of the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics and has a lot of experience in government, in policy, and also in academia. Dr. Robin Chibuka, who is currently the chairman of Standard Bank in Uganda, and Professor Africa Erinho, who's a visiting professor here at Strathmore Business School, but is based at ESA Business School in the Center for Strategy and Globalization. Most welcome. So my task here is very easy. It's just to provide a bit of context for the discussion that will follow, just to give a bit of a sense of how institutions have evolved in Africa and how that's impacted economic performance. Right, so when we talk about institutions, we're talking about rules of the game, both in terms of formal institutions, like for example constitutions, laws, regulations, but we're also talking about informal institutions which have to do with society's values. For example, values towards the common good, values towards corruption, values towards entrepreneurship, and so on. So we use institutions in a broad sense when we look at how institutions have impacted Africa's economic story. And in providing the context, I'll argue that institutions have had a very, very profound effect on the way African economies have developed. Okay? So basically, institutions are important because institutions affect transaction costs. They affect allocative efficiency in society. They provide incentives or disincentives to do certain things. So that makes them very crucial. So if you have inappropriate institutions in place, then you often have the wrong incentives in society. You create the wrong incentives, for example, towards corruption. Or institutions that stifle in entrepreneurship or that make it difficult to set up businesses. This will be developed further by the different speakers. So I'm just giving a bit of a context. This is kind of the diagram you see there is kind of the main context that I provide for the presentations that will follow. And here I basically argue that you can divide the post-independence economic and political history of Africa into three main phases. The first phase, basically you say, would run from the early 60s up to about the mid-1970s. Okay, this is the phase of early optimism. Okay, where many African countries had got independence. They were very optimistic about the future. The dominant development paradigms kind of had grand theories. They were focused on state-led development. There was a lot of belief in models. Development economists were much more confident about their models at that particular time. Okay, but by the mid-70s, approaching the late 1970s, for a number of reasons, a lot of this optimism had disappeared. And then we moved into a very difficult phase in Africa's economic history, which is more or less what you could consider as 20 lost years, the period between more or less 1980 and the turn of the century, 2000, which for a number of reasons, many of which were institutional, and some of which will be elaborated on by some of the other speakers, we more or less, you could say, lost 20 years. Why do I say we lost 20 years? I say we lost 20 years because at the turn of the century, more or less in the year 2000, the World Bank produced a report known as Can Africa Claim the 21st Century? And in that report, they argue that in the year 2000, in many African countries, people were actually poorer than they were in 1980. Okay, so that kind of makes a strong argument for the fact that we, in many ways, and in many sub-Saharan African countries, with a few exceptions, we more or less lost 20 years. Okay. Now, since the turn of the century, something has happened, and you can see in the last 3-4 years, especially, there's been a lot of excitement about Africa as one of the fastest growing emerging markets. So can we say there's a new hope? Is there a basis for saying there's a new hope? At the moment, you could say over the last 10 years, 6 of the fastest growing countries in the world have been African countries. So does that give us new hope? I think the answer to that question depends a lot on the discussion we're going to have, and that depends a lot on the extent to which the quality of institutions has improved over the last few years and is probably going to improve over the next few years. Okay, so just to explain these phases briefly, it's the first phase where you had optimism was basically the early post-colonial period, where in many African states we more or less founded states, okay, based on a previous colonial structure. In many African states, we basically went into a post-colonial period with probably insufficient preparation. a lot of the apparatus that was there in the colonial periods, surprisingly and very interestingly, remained. Okay, you'd expect that in the post-colonial period, probably there would be major changes in institutions, but in fact what developed in many African states was a set of institutions that didn't really dismantle the colonial institutions much, but in fact elaborated them, and in some cases even strengthened them. Okay, so one of the main reasons why the optimism that we had at independence in many African states was not realized was because what in fact developed, the dominant institutions that developed in many African states over the first 15 years, you could say, were institutions that corresponded to a predatory state. Okay, so this is in fact what happened. Okay, whereas small elite groups, dominant elites, more or less consolidated power, and a institutional phenomenon that became very common over the next few decades developed, which many people know as the big man syndrome. Okay, so that developed in one country after another. Okay, and so of course these institutional developments where power was controlled by a small elite, they tended to centralize power around themselves, of course led to the fact that the common good was not promoted in many African states. Right? And in fact, the majority of the population kind of became alienated